The first thing Molly Rourke did was tear the no trespassing sign off my gate and toss it into the weeds like she was clearing a napkin off a dinner table. The second thing she did was look me right in the eye, one hand on her hip, the other holding a can of warm cola, and say, "My daddy says this dock belongs to the association now." The third thing she did was smile when I told her she ought to put that sign back, because she had no idea that by sundown, every word out of her mouth was going to be sitting on a cassette tape in an evidence locker. My name is Mara Donnelly, and in the summer of 1995, I was 49 years old, the elected sheriff of Leland County, Wisconsin, and the tired owner of a little cedar cabin on Blackbird Lake that had belonged to my family longer than most of the people in Pine Bluff Estates had been alive. I did not buy that place because I wanted trouble. Lord knows I had enough of that in town. I bought it because, after 27 years in law enforcement, after a divorce that went on 2 years longer than it should have, after burying my mother the previous winter, I wanted one patch of earth where nobody needed anything from me. No dispatch radio squawking at 6 in the morning, no courtroom hallway full of men in bad ties explaining why they had not done what they were supposed to do, no campaign committee calling my house because somebody thought the county fair pie contest needed a deputy on horseback. I wanted coffee on a dock, loons calling across the water, and maybe a little Benny Goodman playing low on the kitchen radio while I fixed up the screen door my grandfather had built in 1958. That was all. But peace has a funny habit of making some people nervous, especially the kind who have spent too many years mistaking control for respect. Pine Bluff Estates was a new development on the far end of Blackbird Lake, all matching mailboxes, neat gravel drives, gas grills covered in vinyl, and little blue street signs that made the place look more organized than the county courthouse. It was run by the Pine Bluff Lake Association, which sounded harmless enough until you met Wade Rourke. Wade was 56, broad in the shoulders, pink around the cheeks, always dressed like he had just climbed out of a catalog for men who owned boats they never drove themselves. He ran Rourke Marine Supply down by the highway, sat on the bank board, chaired the Lake Association, and believed a handshake was a legal document as long as he was the one doing the shaking. His house sat on the highest hill in Pine Bluff, with a white fence, a flagpole, 2 jet skis, and a porch so wide you could have held a town meeting on it. Wade liked to say he had built Pine Bluff from nothing. What he meant was he had sold a few lots, bullied a few contractors, and discovered that people with mortgages tend to listen when you threaten to make life inconvenient. The first time I met him was 3 weeks after I reopened the cabin for the season. I was staining the rail along my dock, wearing an old Cardinals cap and a shirt with paint on both sleeves, when a white Lincoln Town car came down my drive and stopped where the gravel turned to grass. Wade climbed out slowly, like he was arriving at a funeral for someone he had not liked very much, and behind him came Molly, his only daughter, 18 years old, wearing sunglasses bigger than her face and a denim jacket with a Bon Jovi patch on the back. Wade looked around at the cabin, the old boathouse, my little stretch of shoreline, then gave me that smile men like him use when they have already decided what belongs to them. "Sheriff Donnelly," he said, even though we were nowhere near town and I was holding a paintbrush, "I figured we ought to talk about your place." I said, "Most folks call before they drive out here." He chuckled and looked toward the water. "Well, most folks are not sitting on the future of this community." I remember that line because it was so ridiculous I nearly laughed paint right onto my shoes. Wade told me Pine Bluff was planning a family lake day at the end of the summer, something wholesome and neighborly, barbecue, music, games for the kids, a little fireworks display after dark. Then he told me their shared beach had been closed because of a leak in an old septic line, and the association needed a temporary location. I said that sounds like a problem for the association. He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he already suspected about me. "Your point is adjacent to the subdivision," he said. "There is an old access arrangement. We have lake use rights." I wiped my hands on a rag and said, "You have a road easement across the old county lane, Wade. You do not have a right to my dock, my cabin, my shoreline, or the air over my front porch." His smile got smaller. "You should review your paperwork." I looked at him and said, "You should review yours." Molly laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because she had spent her whole life watching her father win arguments by standing in front of people until they backed away. Wade did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He just looked at me like I was a problem he could solve with enough paperwork and enough pressure. Then he got back in that white Lincoln and drove away, kicking dust across the wildflowers my mother had planted by the mailbox. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived in my rural route box with the Pine Bluff Lake Association seal stamped in dark green across the front. Inside was a notice informing me that my property had been selected as the site for the association's Labor Day Family Lake Day, and that I was expected to provide access by noon on Saturday, September 2nd. It had 3 signatures, a schedule of events, a list of approved food vendors, and a line that said the association appreciated my cooperation in helping preserve community traditions. That part almost made me admire the nerve of it. Almost. I took the papers to the courthouse the next morning, because I have learned that when somebody is waving documents around like a magician's scarf, you do not argue with the scarf. You look for the hand holding it. The county record's office in 1995 was a narrow room with green metal filing cabinets, a window air conditioner that rattled like loose teeth, and a woman named Bernice Vale who had been the deputy clerk since Nixon was president and trusted nobody under the age of 60. Bernice wore reading glasses on a chain, kept butterscotch candies in a glass dish, and could find a deed faster than most people could find their car keys. She listened while I explained why I was there. Then she took one look at the notice, snorted through her nose, and said, "Well, that has Wade work all over it." She pulled the plat books, the old survey maps, the original lake access agreements, and a yellowed folder from 1963 that smelled like dust and old cigarettes. We spread everything out across a table under a buzzing fluorescent light. The Pine Bluff boundary ended nearly half a mile east of my gate. My property had never been part of the development, never been annexed, never been offered for shared use, and the only easement on record was a utility path that ran nowhere near my cabin. Then Bernice found something else, a supposed amendment filed 6 months earlier that gave the association limited recreational use of community-adjacent shoreline parcels. It sounded official if you did not know better, but there was one problem. Nobody can just invent a category called community-adjacent and make it law. The document had been recorded with no attached survey, no legal description, and a signature from a former board secretary who had been dead for 4 years. Bernice took off her glasses, looked at me over the top of them, and said, "Mara, either Wade Rourke is an idiot or he thinks everyone else is." I said, "Those are not mutually exclusive." She laughed so hard she had to put her hand on the desk. I should have felt relieved, but I did not. I knew men like Wade. They never build a lie this sloppy unless they are standing on top of something worse. That afternoon I called him from the kitchen wall phone at the cabin, the kind with the long beige cord that could stretch halfway across the room if you really needed to pace while you talked. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Rourke," I said, "this is Mara Donnelly. I checked the county plat." There was a pause, just long enough for me to hear him decide which version of himself he was going to use. "Then you know the association's position," I said. "I know your amendment is garbage. I know the secretary whose name is on it has been dead since 1991, and I know my property is not part of Pine Bluff." He sighed like I was disappointing him personally. "Mara, you are getting hung up on technical details." I said, "Wade, land ownership is mostly technical details. Boundaries, deeds, signatures, dates. Folks tend to care about them when somebody is trying to throw a party in their living room." His voice went colder. "You are making enemies over a community event." I sat down at my mother's old kitchen table, looked through the window at the water, and said, "No, Wade, I am meeting one." Then I hung up. The next week was quiet in the way a field gets quiet before a storm. I went back to work in town, handled a domestic dispute near the grain elevator, a string of break-ins by a couple of boys who thought stealing car stereos made them Bonnie and Clyde, and a county board meeting where two men nearly came to blows over a culvert. But every evening when I drove back out to Blackbird Lake, I noticed little things. A pickup parked too long near my gate, tire tracks in the grass by the old boathouse. Someone had moved the private property sign from my dock and set it face down on the shore. One morning I found a flyer taped to the post office bulletin board, printed on pale blue paper, announcing the Pine Bluff Labor Day Lake Day at Donnelly Point. There was a little cartoon canoe on it, a hamburger, a list of activities, and at the bottom, in Wade's bold typewriter font, the words "A celebration of shared lake traditions." I took it down, folded it in half, and put it in my purse. When I got home, I called my chief deputy, Eli Madsen, a square-shouldered Norwegian with a mustache like a paintbrush and a sense of humor so dry it could start a brush fire. I told him I might need his help over Labor Day weekend, but I also told him I did not want any special treatment. "It is my property," I said. "That means I want this cleaner than clean." Eli was quiet for a moment, then said, "You think Rourke is really dumb enough to show up?" I looked at the blue flyer on my counter and said, "Eli, men like Wade do not think of themselves as breaking rules. They think rules are things that happen to other people." He grunted. "Well, I will keep the shift light and I will have state patrol on standby. Since you are involved, they can handle the arrest side if it gets there." That was exactly what I wanted. I was the sheriff, but I was also the complainant, and the law means less than nothing if you bend it when it suits you. The first real sign came on Wednesday afternoon. I had taken the day off to replace a warped board on the porch, and around 2:30 I heard laughter down by the water. I walked around the side of the cabin and found Molly Rourke standing on my dock with 3 friends, 2 boys and another girl, all of them dressed like they were headed to a music video instead of trespassing on a middle-aged woman's property. One of the boys was holding a VHS camcorder the size of a lunchbox, and Molly was talking straight into it. "This is where the party is going to be," she said, twirling around with her arms out. "Dad says the association is finally taking back lake access." Then she spotted me. She did not look scared. That part stuck with me. She looked annoyed, like I had walked into a room she had already reserved. "You cannot be here," I said. Molly smirked. "Actually, we can. My dad said this is association shoreline." I said, "Your dad said a lot of things. That does not make them true." One of the boys held up the camcorder and said, "We are filming, Sheriff." I looked at him and said, "Good. Then make sure you get this part." I walked to the edge of the dock and pointed toward the road. "You are on private property. You have been told to leave. If you come back without permission, you will be trespassing. If you damage anything, you will be charged. If you touch that boat, I will make you regret it before your parents finish dialing my office." They all got quiet. Molly rolled her eyes, but her voice lost a little of its shine. "You are really going to make a big deal out of a party?" I said, "No, honey. Your father did that when he decided my home was his stage." As they left, I noticed Molly had picked up something from the porch rail. It was my grandfather's old brass compass, small enough to fit in a pocket worn smooth around the edges from years of fishing trips. He had carried it in his coat through 2 wars, then kept it on his boat until the day he died. I said, "Molly." She turned. I held out my hand. "Put it back." She looked down at the compass, and for 1 second I saw something different in her face. Not guilt exactly, more like surprise that an old object could matter to anyone. She set it on the rail and walked away. I watched her climb into the back seat of Wade's truck, and I had this feeling in my chest I had not felt since my first year in uniform. Not fear, not anger, recognition. That was a child who had grown up in a house where consequences were always for somebody else. That night, I pulled a box out from under the bed and set up the old Panasonic VHS camcorder my brother had given me for Christmas. It was a brick of a thing, black plastic, shoulder strap, viewfinder tube, the kind that made every family picnic look like a hostage negotiation. I placed it in the upstairs window facing the drive, then set another borrowed camera behind the woodpile where it could catch the gate. I bought a pack of blank tapes at the Kmart in town, labeled each one with a black marker, and tested the time stamp twice. I also put a small voice recorder in the flower box beside the porch steps, because I had a feeling Wade was the kind of man who said his most honest things when he thought nobody was listening. On Thursday, Bernice called me at the office. Her voice was tight. She had been digging through old association records, because once Bernice got interested in something, she treated it like a bloodhound treated a pork chop. She found board minutes from the previous year showing that Pine Bluff had collected $42,000 for a shoreline restoration fund, supposedly meant to repair the public dock, fix septic drainage, and improve the beach. But no repairs had happened. The public dock was still leaning sideways. The beach still smelled like algae and dead minnows. The septic line was still a mess. The money, however, had moved through 3 accounts, including one at the Lakeview Savings Bank where Wade's name appeared beside a business called Rourke Development Partners. Bernice said, "I'm not saying he stole it." I said, "No, Bernice. You are saying you found a trail worth following." She went quiet, then said, "Mara, he is trying to buy land on the North Shore." The old Carlson Orchard. I knew the place. 50 acres of scrub woods, lake frontage, an abandoned apple barn, and a long, narrow strip of shoreline with no usable boat launch. Suddenly Wade's plan started to make sense. He did not want my cabin just for one party. He wanted my point. If he could convince buyers, lenders, and association members that Pine Bluff already had access through my land, he could build a marina, sell new vacation lots, and turn the lake into a brochure. I sat in my office with the window open to the August heat, listening to the fax machine spit out copies of bank records 1 page at a time, and I realized this was not about fireworks, or hamburgers, or even a bad man with a clipboard. Wade Rourke was trying to build an empire on land he did not own and money he could not explain. By Friday morning, I had enough to contact the State Division of Criminal Investigation. A woman named Ruth Alvarez came down from Madison, sharp-eyed, soft-spoken, the kind of investigator who made people tell the truth because they got tired of trying to lie around her. She met me at a diner outside town where the coffee tasted like burnt rope and the waitress called everybody sweetheart whether they deserved it or not. I laid out the fake amendment, the old survey maps, the association minutes, the bank records, and a copy of the flyer. Ruth looked at everything, then said, "You think he is going through with the event?" I said, "I think he has spent too long telling people he owns that lake. Men like that do not cancel, they double down." She nodded. "Then do not stop him too soon. Do not provoke him, do not bait him, but if he crosses the line, let him cross it where we can see it." I said, "That was my thought." She looked at me for a second and smiled. "I can see why you got elected." By that evening, the old cabin did not feel like a retreat anymore. It felt like a wire stretched across a dark road, and I hated that. I hated checking locks on a place my mother had trusted enough to leave open during thunderstorms. I hated looking at the water and wondering whether Wade was going to turn it into a courtroom. But more than that, I hated the feeling that if I let him do this, every person he had bullied in Pine Bluff would learn the wrong lesson. They would learn that all a man needed to take something was enough confidence and a fake seal on a letterhead, and I had spent too many years wearing a badge to let that be the lesson. Part 2. Labor Day Saturday arrived hot and bright, the kind of late summer day where the sky looked hard enough to crack, and every pine needle smelled warm in the sun. I woke before 6, made coffee in my mother's old percolator, and stood on the dock with a mug in one hand and a list in the other. Gate lock checked, porch camera running, VHS tapes labeled, State Patrol notified, Deputy Madsen on standby, Ruth Alvarez 15 minutes away in an unmarked sedan with a search warrant application ready if the evidence gave her enough probable cause. I remember looking across Blackbird Lake and thinking how strange it was that the world could be so beautiful on a day when you knew somebody was about to try and break it. Around 11:30, the first vehicle came down the drive, a brown pickup pulling a trailer with folding tables, coolers, and 2 big portable speakers. I stepped onto the porch before the driver reached the gate. He rolled down his window, squinted up at me, and said, "Mrs. Rourke said the Lake Day was here." I said, "Mrs. Rourke did not say that. Wade Rourke did, and he lied to you. This is private property. The man glanced at the flyer taped to his dashboard, then looked back at me. "I am just the delivery guy," I said. "Then you are welcome to turn around and deliver your table somewhere else." He did. I wish I could say that ended it, but Wade was not built for embarrassment. By 1 o'clock, cars started gathering along the road outside the gate. Minivans, pickup trucks, a red Camaro with a cracked windshield, 2 station wagons, and a white stretch limousine that had no business on a gravel road in northern Wisconsin. Somebody had rented it from Green Bay. I watched from the upstairs window as teenagers climbed out carrying bags of ice, cases of beer, lawn chairs, coolers, boom boxes, and one cardboard box that I later learned was filled with fireworks. Molly was in the middle of them, wearing white shorts, a red bandana tied around her hair, and the same expression she had worn when she tore down my sign. Not nervous, not uncertain, proud, like she was hosting a party in a house she had inherited. I had called the county dispatcher before any of them arrived. I told them exactly what I had, exactly what I expected, and exactly what I needed. No sirens until I asked. No lights at the road. No one was to rush in unless there was an immediate danger. I wanted the record clean, the evidence clean, and the kids safe. I did not want a show. Wade was the one who wanted a show. At 2:15, he gave me one. His white Lincoln came down the drive with a blue banner tied to the back that read Pine Bluff Lake Day 1995. Behind him were 2 more trucks carrying a grill, a generator, and a stack of plastic cups. He stopped at my locked gate, got out, and looked up toward the cabin. I was standing on the porch in jeans and a faded red flannel shirt, holding my coffee mug like I had nowhere else to be. Wade smiled. "Mara, you are making this awkward." I said. "Wade, you drove a limousine to a trespass. Awkward left town about an hour ago." A few people in the crowd laughed, and I saw his jaw tight. He walked closer to the gate. "The association voted on this." I said. "No, you voted on this. That is not the same thing." He lifted a folder from under his arm. "I have the amendment right here," I said. "I have the original plat, the recorder's office, a dead secretary, and a state investigator. Bring whichever paperwork makes you feel better." His face changed then. The friendly president looked drained away, and underneath it was a man who had been told no too many times in 1 week. "You do not understand what is at stake," he said. I said, "I understand you are standing at my gate with alcohol, fireworks, a rented limousine, and a bunch of people you have convinced this is your property. I understand that pretty well." Wade looked back at the crowd. A few parents were there, mostly men in polo shirts and women with paper plates, people who looked uncomfortable but had already committed themselves by showing up. They wanted to believe him. It is easier to believe the loudest person in a room than to admit you have been following a liar. Then Molly stepped forward. She was holding a pair of bolt cutters. I had not seen them before because she had them tucked behind one leg. She looked at her father. He looked at the chain. He looked at me. I do not know whether he gave her a nod or whether she had been trained so well she did not need one, but she lifted the cutters, slid them around the chain, and squeezed. The snap carried all the way to the cabin. It was a small sound, really metal breaking in the heat, but I felt it go through me like a gunshot. The gate swung open. Kids cheered. Wade lifted both arms like a man cutting the ribbon on a shopping center. "Welcome to the lake," he called out. And just like that, my quiet point filled with people. They dragged coolers across my grass, set folding tables under my birch trees, hung a banner between 2 pines, and rolled speakers down near the water. Somebody fired up the generator. Somebody else started a cassette of Tom Petty and turned it loud enough to shake the cabin windows. 2 boys jumped off my dock with their shoes still on. A little girl ran across the porch with a hot dog in each hand. A man I had never seen before opened my boathouse door and looked inside like he was shopping at a garage sale. I stood there for a long minute and let my anger settle into something useful. The law does not care how offended you are. It cares what happened, who saw it, what you can prove. So I picked up the camcorder, pressed record, and started walking slowly along the porch. I filmed the broken chain. I filmed the coolers. I filmed the beer cans. I filmed the association banner. I filmed Wade standing by the grill, shaking hands and accepting congratulations like he had just saved the county from a flood. When he saw the camera, he came up the steps. "You need to stop filming people," he said. I said, "I am filming a crime scene." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You are turning a family event into something ugly." I said, "No, Wade. You turned a trespass into a family event." He leaned close enough that I could smell his aftershave, something sharp and expensive. "You think being sheriff means you can embarrass me?" I lowered the camera and said, "I think being a sheriff means I know the difference between embarrassment and consequences." He stared at me for a long second. Then he smiled again, but it was the smile people wear when they are standing on thin ice and trying not to look down. "You will regret this," he said. I said, "That line is getting tired, Wade. You should write a new one." He went back down the steps, and I let him. I let the afternoon move forward because every minute gave us more proof. Around 4, I saw Molly hand a beer to a boy who could not have been older than 16. Around 5, a man from the association dragged a gasoline can over near the generator, and 2 teenagers started setting off bottle rockets in the sand not 20 feet away. Around 6, a fight broke out near the dock when one of the boys tried to take a canoe from my boathouse. It was not a big fight, just shoving and yelling, but it was enough to make the parents finally start looking worried. The music was too loud. The beer was too easy. The kids were too young. And Wade was still walking around with a plastic cup in his hand, telling everyone they were part of something special. At 6:47, the event gave me the peace I needed. Molly climbed onto the tailgate of a pickup with a microphone from the speaker system and yelled, "This is Pine Bluff land now, so nobody has to listen to old lady rules." The crowd laughed. Wade laughed too. He raised his cup. "That is right," he called out. "The association takes care of its own." I looked at Eli, who was parked 50 yards down the road in an unmarked county vehicle. He was watching through binoculars, waiting for my signal. I touched the brim of my cap. Then I walked inside the cabin, set down the camcorder, and opened the closet by the front door. My uniform shirt was hanging there, pressed and ready. I had not worn it all day because I wanted no confusion about why I was recording. I was there first as the homeowner. But now the homeowner had enough. I put on the shirt, clipped my badge to the front, tucked the radio onto my belt, and stepped back onto the porch. The music was still pounding. The lake was full of kids yelling and splashing. The sun had started to fall behind the trees, turning the water orange. And right then, for one strange second, the whole scene looked almost beautiful. Then I keyed the radio and said, "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Donnelly. Activate the units." The sound came first, distant at the beginning, then growing louder. Sirens, more than one. The music stopped in the middle of a song. Heads turned toward the road. The first state patrol cruiser came through the open gate with its lights flashing, followed by 2 county units, then Ruth Alvarez's unmarked sedan. Red and blue washed over the cabin, the cars, the water, Wade's white Lincoln, Molly's face. People froze with cups in their hands. A girl near the dock started crying before anybody even spoke. Wade walked toward me fast, waving both arms. "What is this?" he shouted. "Turn those lights off. This is a private association event." I stepped down from the porch, my badge catching the patrol lights, and said, "No, Wade. This is an unlawful gathering on private property. You are all being asked to remain where you are until we sort out what happened." He stared at the badge like he had forgotten I owned one. Molly looked from me to her father, then to the troopers. "Dad," she said. Wade did not answer. He was busy trying to rearrange reality with his face. Captain Barlow from State Patrol walked up beside me, calm as Sunday morning. He said, "Mr. Rourke, I need you to step away from the sheriff." Wade pointed at me. "She set this up. She is using her office to settle a personal score." I said, "No, Wade, I gave you notice. I told you the land was mine. I told you your amendment was invalid. You cut the lock anyway." Ruth Alvarez held up a plastic evidence bag with the broken chain inside. "And we have video," she said. Wade went quiet. That was the first time all day I saw fear touch him. Not panic, not yet, just fear. It looked strange on him, like a suit that did not fit. The next 2 hours were long, hot, and ugly in the way real consequences usually are. We did not cuff every kid and throw them in cars. This was not television. We called parents. We checked IDs. We poured out alcohol. We documented property damage. We separated the minors from the adults. We had fire personnel remove the fireworks and secure the fuel near the generator. One of the troopers found a case of beer in the trunk of Wade's Lincoln, and another found the association checkbook in a catering folder under the passenger seat. The invoices were not for a picnic. They were billed to the Pine Bluff Shoreline Restoration Fund. Chicken, burgers, ice, rented chairs, speakers, fireworks, the limousine, all paid from a fund meant to fix the public dock and septic line. Wade tried to explain it away. Community expenses, he said. Ruth looked at the invoices, then looked at him. Mr. Rourke, did the board approve this spending? He said. I am the board president. Ruth said, that was not my question. Then Molly came down the path holding something in her closed fist. She had stopped crying by then, but her face had changed. The sunglasses were gone. The confidence was gone. She walked up to me slowly and opened her hand. My grandfather's brass compass lay in her palm. I took this earlier, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I thought it was just old junk. I looked at the compass, then at her. A part of me wanted to say something sharp. I had plenty of sharp things in me that night. But she was 18, scared, and finally seeing her father as somebody other than the man who always knew best. So I took the compass, closed her fingers gently, and said, nothing is just junk when it belongs to somebody else. She nodded and started crying again. Wade saw that, and something in him snapped. He came toward us, red-faced, shouting, do not you dare turn my daughter against me. Captain Barlow stepped between us before I had to. Mr. Rourke, you are being detained for criminal trespass, criminal damage to property, furnishing alcohol to minors, and obstruction of an ongoing investigation. Wade looked at me. You are going to regret this, he said again, but this time it sounded small. I said, maybe, but I will regret it less than letting you do this to somebody who does not have a badge. He was placed in the back of a patrol car just after 9 o'clock. The party ended in silence. By midnight, the grass was torn up, my dock was scraped, my porch rail had a boot print on it, and the lake smelled like spilled beer, gasoline, and wet leaves. The last cruiser rolled away just after 1 in the morning. Eli stood beside me near the dock, hands in his pockets, his mustache drooping from the humidity. He looked at the mess, then at me. Hell of a lake day, he said. I laughed even though I was tired enough to cry. I have had quieter dental work. He nodded toward the road. You think this is over? I looked at the broken lock lying on the porch, the flash of red lights fading through the trees, and the box of evidence on my kitchen table. No, I said. I think this is where it starts. Part 3. The next morning, Blackbird Lake was still. Not peaceful exactly, not yet, but still. The kind of stillness that comes after a storm when every branch is wet and the whole world looks like it is waiting to see what survived. I made coffee, walked down to the dock, and found 3 beer cans caught in the reeds. I picked them up one by one. Then I found a red plastic cup under the canoe. Then a broken pair of sunglasses near the boathouse. I kept cleaning because sometimes your hands need work before your heart can catch up. By 9 o'clock, the local radio station was already talking about it. By 10, the paper had a reporter outside the sheriff's office. By noon, somebody had faxed a copy of the police report to half the county. This was 1995, so gossip did not move through phones in people's pockets. It moved through diner booths, church parking lots, hardware store counters, and the little chain of callers who knew exactly how to make a secret reach the other side of the lake before lunch. People started coming forward. Not all at once. That is not how people come forward when they have been afraid for years. First, it was a retired schoolteacher named Norman Fenn, who brought in a stack of fine notices Wade had sent him for keeping a boat trailer in his own driveway. Then a widow named Clara Healy came to the station with copies of checks she had written to the association for supposed landscaping violations that had never existed. Then a young couple showed up with a letter threatening to place a lien on their house because they painted their porch the wrong color. Every story was small by itself. Put together, they were a map of a man who had learned he could take a little from everyone because nobody wanted to be the first person to fight him. Ruth Alvarez and the state investigators moved fast. The fake amendment gave them the first door. The party invoices gave them the second. The association bank accounts gave them the third. By Tuesday, a judge signed a warrant for Pine Bluff's office. Wade's marine supply business, and the little shed behind his house where he kept records nobody was supposed to see. I did not go on the search. I stayed at the station. That was the right thing to do. I had already given my statements, turned over the tapes, and shown them where the bodies were buried, figuratively speaking. Now it belonged to the investigators. But Ruth called me from Wade's office that afternoon. I could hear file drawers opening in the background. She said, "You were right about the marina." I asked, "How bad?" She said, "Bad enough that I would sit down before I tell you." I sat. Wade had been moving association money through a shell company for almost 3 years. He had used the Shoreline Fund to make payments on the Carlson Orchard deal, paid off debts from Rourke Marine Supply, covered the lease on a new boat he kept hidden in a storage yard, and spent thousands on architectural drawings for a private marina project he had never disclosed to the board. But the worst part was the plan itself. He had told the bank that Pine Bluff already controlled access through Donnelly Point. He had attached the fraudulent amendment. He had used my land as collateral without my permission, hoping that once construction started and money moved, I would be forced to negotiate. He was not throwing that party because he wanted families to eat burgers by the lake. He was staging a public claim. He wanted photos, witnesses, flyers, anything he could point to later and say, "See, the association has always used this property." I closed my eyes when Ruth told me that. For a long time, I just sat there listening to the old ceiling fan tick over my desk. Then I said, "He was willing to put drunk kids near fireworks and fuel just to make a lie look older." Ruth said, "That is what it looks like." I hung up and stared at my badge. I had worn that piece of metal for nearly 3 decades, and I still had not figured out how some people could look at a good thing, a lake, a neighborhood, a group of families trying to get along, and see nothing but a place to plant their flag. Wade's arraignment was held that Thursday. The courthouse was packed, not because people love justice, but because people love a fall when they have spent years watching somebody stand too tall. Wade came in wearing a gray suit, no boat shoes, no smile, no gold watch. His lawyer argued that the Lake Day had been a misunderstanding, that the property boundaries were unclear, that the association had acted in good faith, that Wade had merely exercised poor judgment under community pressure. I sat in the back row and listened to a man try to turn greed into a weather report. Then the prosecutor played the VHS tape. The courtroom watched Molly cut the lock. They watched the crowd enter my property. They watched Wade raise his cup and say the association was taking care of its own. They watched him tell me I would regret it. The tape was grainy, the sound was thin, and the picture shook once when I shifted my grip, but it did not need to be perfect. It was true. That was enough. Wade looked over his shoulder at me when the tape ended. I do not know what he expected to find in my face. Anger, maybe. Victory. Something he could use to tell himself I had wanted him to lose. But all I felt was tired. Tired and sad because I had known men like him my whole career. Men who could have been useful, respected, even loved if they had learned the difference between leading people and owning them. The judge set bail, ordered Wade to stay away from my property, and froze the Pine Bluff Association accounts pending investigation. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps. One man from the local television station asked me if I had set Wade Rourke up. I looked at him, then at the cameras, then at the people from Pine Bluff standing across the street with their arms folded. "No," I said. "I told Mr. Rourke the truth several times. He chose not to believe it." That answer made the evening news, which annoyed me because I have always hated hearing my own voice on television, but it also did something I did not expect. It gave people permission to speak. The Pine Bluff board called an emergency meeting the following Monday at the community hall, a squat little building with wood paneling, folding chairs, and a coffee pot older than most marriages. Wade had been removed from office by then. The board members looked pale and nervous, like people who had just realized they had been sitting in a room with a gas leak for years. The new acting president was a woman named Helen Vargo, a retired bookkeeper in her late 60s who had spent most of her time in Pine Bluff quietly organizing potlucks and keeping minutes nobody read. Helen had silver hair, thick glasses, and the kind of voice that made grown men sit down when she told them to. She stood at the front of that room with a stack of papers in her hands and said, "For years, we let one man make decisions because it was easier than asking questions. That ends tonight." Nobody applauded at first. They were too ashamed. Then somebody in the back clapped once. Then another person joined. Then the whole room stood. It was not a loud applause. It was not a movie moment. It was more like a room full of people letting out a breath they had been holding too long. Molly was there that night, sitting alone in the last row. She had cut her hair shorter. She was wearing a plain sweatshirt, no sunglasses, no denim jacket, no smile. When the meeting ended, she waited until most people had left, then came over to where I was standing by the coffee urn. I expected her to say nothing. I would have understood if she never wanted to see me again. But she looked at me and said, "Can I talk to you?" We went outside. It was cool for September, the kind of evening where you can smell leaves even though most of them are still green. Molly stood under the parking lot light and kept twisting the strap of her purse around her hand. Finally she said, "My dad was not always like this." I did not say anything. She looked toward the road. After my mom left, he started saying everybody wanted to take things from us. The house, the business, the lake. He said he had to fight harder than everybody else because nobody respected him. I believed him. Her voice cracked a little. "I thought he was protecting us." I said, "Sometimes people call it protection when they are really just trying to keep control." She looked at me. "Do you hate me?" That question stayed with me. Not because I did not know the answer, but because she had probably been asking herself that about a lot of people. I said, "No, I do not hate you, but you broke the lock. You came onto my property. You took something that was not yours. You will have to own that." She nodded. "I know," I said. "Owning it is where you start. It is not where you end." She wiped her face with her sleeve. "What do I do now?" I thought about my grandfather's compass sitting on the kitchen table at the cabin, cleaned and polished, pointing north even after all those years. I said, "You find out what kind of person you want to be when your father is not telling you." The investigation went on through the fall. The newspapers printed figures that got larger every week. $32,000, $47,000, $58,000 and change. There were forged checks, fake vendor invoices, a private loan Wade had taken against association land without approval, and a handwritten note in one of his files outlining a deal with a developer from Milwaukee. The note said, "Donnelly Access Essential." That was it. 3 words. My home reduced to a line in a crooked man's plan. The final number came to $61,420. That was how much Wade had diverted from the association over 3 years. Some of it went to his business. Some of it went to the marina plan. Some of it went to a second mortgage on his house. And some of it nobody could explain. That part bothered me most. I have seen people steal because they are desperate. I have seen people steal because they are hungry. Wade had stolen because he had gotten used to no one stopping him. In November, he accepted a plea agreement. Criminal trespass, fraud, forgery, theft by deception, and several financial counts connected to the association funds. He avoided a long public trial, but he did not avoid responsibility. The judge sentenced him to state prison, ordered restitution, barred him from serving on any association board, and required him to surrender his real estate licenses and business permits. When the sentence was read, Wade stood there with both hands on the defense table. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he did not seem to hear it. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, not because prison had scared him, though I am sure it had, but because the story he had told himself for years had finally fallen apart. He was not the builder of Pine Bluff. He was not the guardian of the lake. He was not the man holding the community together. He was a man who had taken from his neighbors and called it leadership. After the hearing, Molly found me again outside the courthouse. It had started snowing, just light flakes at first, sticking to the stone steps and the shoulders of people's coats. She had been assigned community service as part of her plea on the trespass and property damage charges. She said she was going to work with the county conservation crew cleaning litter around Blackbird Lake. "I know that does not fix anything," she said. I said, "No. But it is better than pretending nothing happened." She nodded. Then she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photograph from the day of the party, one of those disposable camera prints with bad lighting and red eyes. It showed the lake at sunset before the police came, the water orange, the trees black against the sky, the dock crowded with people who had no business being there. On the back, Molly had written, "I thought that night meant freedom. I was wrong. I still have that photograph. Not because I enjoy looking at it, but because it reminds me how easy it is to mistake getting your way for being free." Over the next year, Pine Bluff changed. Not overnight. Real change almost never happens that way. Helen Vargo and the new board held open meetings. They posted budgets on the bulletin board at the grocery store. They required 3 signatures on every check. They brought in an outside accountant. They rewrote the rules so no president could approve spending a loan, no homeowner could be fined without a hearing, and no piece of land could ever be claimed through a vague sentence typed on a letterhead. People started showing up to meetings. They argued, sure. This was Wisconsin, and nothing brings out opinions faster than a lake association and a $10 fee. But they argued in the open, which was better than whispering in fear. By the next summer, the public dock had been repaired. The septic line was fixed. The beach reopened. Helen invited me to a real community picnic held at the actual association park, not on anybody's stolen property. I almost did not go. I have never been comfortable being thanked in public. But Eli talked me into it. He said, "You can stand by the potato salad and look miserable. That is practically your brand." So I went. There were families on blankets, kids throwing a football, old men discussing fishing lures, a little band playing old country songs under a canopy. No fireworks near fuel cans. No broken locks. No banners claiming ownership of something that did not belong to them. Just people trying to have an ordinary day by a lake. Molly was there too. She had spent months with the conservation crew, and she was working part-time at the marina in town, not her father's business, a different place, run by a woman who did not care who her dad was. She came over with 2 paper cups of lemonade and handed me one. "You look uncomfortable," she said. I said, "I am a sheriff at a picnic. It is a professional hazard." She laughed, and it was the first real laugh I had heard from her. Then she looked out at the water. "Do you think he will ever change?" she asked. I knew who she meant. I took a drink of lemonade and thought about it. "I do not know," I said. "People can change, but they have to want the truth more than they want their old excuses." She nodded slowly. "He wrote me a letter." I did not ask what it said. After a minute she added, "He said you ruined his life." I looked at the lake, at the kids running along the shore, at Helen arguing with someone over whether the raffle tickets should be $2 or $3. Then I said, "No, Molly. I stopped him from ruining other people's lives. What he does with his own is up to him." That evening I went back to my cabin. The sun was low, the lake was calm, and the screen door still stuck a little when I opened it. I poured coffee into my chipped blue mug and walked down to the dock. My grandfather's brass compass sat in my pocket. I had started carrying it again, not because I needed directions, but because it reminded me that some things keep pointing true even when the world around them gets confused. I thought about Wade in prison, angry probably, still looking for someone else to blame. I thought about Molly trying to build a life that was not shaped by his mistakes. I thought about all the people in Pine Bluff who had stayed silent because silence felt safer than conflict. And I thought about how close I had come to turning that whole thing into a personal war. I could have shouted. I could have humiliated him. I could have used my badge like a weapon instead of a responsibility. But the truth did not need any of that. It just needed patience, records, witnesses, and somebody willing to say no without blinking. A few weeks later, I got one last letter in the mail. The return address was the state correctional facility where Wade was serving his sentence. I stood in the kitchen holding it for a long time before I opened it. There were only 4 lines inside. He wrote that he had been thinking about Blackbird Lake. He wrote that he never intended for anyone to get hurt. He wrote that he had lost everything. And then he asked whether I would tell the parole board that he had once done good things for the community. I sat at the table until the coffee went cold. There are people who would say I should have thrown that letter away. There are people who would say I should have written back and told him exactly what I thought. I did neither. I put it in the drawer beside the old property deed and the first flyer he ever sent me. Maybe one day I will answer. Maybe I will not. Because forgiveness is not the same as pretending, and justice is not the same as revenge. Sometimes the hardest thing in the world is knowing where one ends and the other begins. So I will leave that question with you. If you were in my place, would you have helped Wade Rourke at his parole hearing after everything he did, or would you have let the silence speak for itself? Tell me what you think in the comments, because every town has a Wade Rourke, every neighborhood has someone who mistakes control for leadership, and every one of us has to decide when it is time to stay quiet, and when it is time to stand at the gate and say, "No, this is not yours." If this story made you think of someone, share it with them, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who found out that truth does not always arrive loud. Sometimes it just waits patiently by the water until the lies run out of places to hide.